Hey, so welcome back. We had a great panel on German and Austrian resistance, but now we're going to shift gears and really shift to the other part of the globe to look at resistance in the Pacific. This is one of two sessions in today's symposium to focus on Asia, titled Living Under the Rising Sun, Resistance to Japanese Occupation, is sometimes overlooked by historians who tend to focus on the European theater. But our two panelists here, Dr. Rico Jose from the University of Philippines Diliman and Dr. Ethan Mark from Leiden University in the Netherlands, will provide interesting explorations of resistance to Japanese control in the Philippines and of daily life in Indonesia under Japanese rule. Presidential counselor and longtime friend of the museum, Rich Frank, will be chairing today's session. Rich is an internationally recognized authority on the Asia-Pacific War and is a perfect person to serve as the chair of this panel. He's the author of numerous books on the subject, including his most recent Tower of Skulls, which is the first in a trilogy on the war in the Pacific. I'm told it's a trilogy, right? And he was nominated for the Gilder Lehrman Prize in Military History. So with Rich, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you right now. Thanks, Rich.
Hey, thank you, Mike. Occupation is a searing moral audit of nations and peoples. It normally will show a wide spectrum of behavior, from servile collaboration to heroic resistance and virtually everything in between. Because it is such a fraught subject, it is a topic that for many nations and peoples is very hard to come back and grapple with honestly, which is why I think most of the scholarship you're going to find on those issues, at least the best scholarship, only developed decades after the event. Our panel this morning will give you, I think, a different perspective on this because the literature, certainly that has been available here, has been very heavily concentrated on Europe and events there. And we have deliberately picked this panel to provide two very contrasting examples of what happened in terms of resistance in Asia and the Pacific. The Filipino population certainly provided examples all along the spectrum I described, but without a doubt, they mounted one of the greatest resistance movements in the entirety of World War II. Americans played a role, but as you'll see and hear, Filipino agency was absolutely paramount as to what happened. Our other subject is what was then called the Netherlands East Indies, which is now Indonesia, which is actually one of the greatest and yet least known large nations and populations in the world. Prior to the Japanese occupation in 1942, the Netherlands East Indies had been a Dutch colony. In contrast, in the Philippines, the Filipino people had been promised independence after a 10-year home rule and were effectively conducting their own domestic affairs prior to the Japanese occupation. This made an enormous difference, I believe, in the response of these two peoples. The Dutch, by contrast, had occupied at least parts of the Netherlands East Indies for hundreds of years, and they had no idea, they saw no horizon for the end of that colonial occupation of the Netherlands East Indies. And it's very telling that when the island of Java was surrendered in March 1942 and the Dutch colonial government surrendered, the Dutch military commander acknowledged that he was not going to attempt to withdraw into the hinterland and conduct a resistance movement because the population was far too hostile. Now, I'm always a believer in short introductions. I have never yet been to a performance in which the introduction was more memorable than the actual discussion. So we are, however, blessed with who we have here. Clearly, Dr. Ricardo Jose is internationally recognized as a leading Filipino historian of World War II. In fact, I would describe him, in my view, as the inspirational leader of that whole effort. And you will gather from his presentation today just an incredible depth of knowledge he has of all of these related subjects and his really superb scholarship. Dr. Ethan Mark is a specialist initially with respect to modern Japanese history, but he has gone into a very important sort of sidelight or whatever with respect to Indonesia. And if we were in the business of awarding scholarly awards for valor, I would have given one to Dr. Mark, because it's a very, very important topic, yet it is one that offers really not the normal set of documentary sources that we tend to look for. And he had to be incredibly resourceful and clever in trying to work out this story when the normal scholarly tools of readily available evidence simply are not there. So with that having been said, I'm going to turn loose my colleagues to demonstrate to you that everything I've said about them is absolutely true. And we'll start with Dr. Jose.
Okay, good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming to this morning's panel. Thank you also for inviting me to this panel. This is my first time in New Orleans, but since I only have 15 minutes, let's go on to the subject. So let me start with the first slide here that I have. The Philippines didn't start World War II blank. It was not a tabula rasa kind of thing. There was a long history of resistance already there. Before the Spaniards came, Filipinos were fighting against intruders. And even Magellan himself, we just commemorated the 500th anniversary of his arrival in the Philippines, was killed in the Philippines because of resistance as early as 1521. So throughout the Spanish period, there was a whole series of uprisings, which culminated in the Revolution of 1896 and continued into 1898 with a proclamation of independence. And that's when Commodore Dewey came into the Philippines. And that war for independence continued for a few more years afterwards, a very bloody war. But gradually, the United States fell into, the Filipinos fell into line, and the Filipinos became appreciative of what the Americans were doing. And the Americans also, there was a love and hate relationship at the same time. By 1935, the Philippines had become a commonwealth. It was autonomous in almost all respects except foreign affairs and finance. And one of the main prerogatives of that commonwealth was defense of the country. The Philippines had to prepare itself to defend itself once independence was achieved. And therefore, a pre-war defense plan with General Douglas MacArthur as military advisor was there to supervise the development of Philippine defenses. This had to be very economical. It had to be something that did not cost very much. And interestingly enough, if you look at the picture that's here, this is MacArthur in his desk at his headquarters. Looking over his shoulder is none other than Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was his main assistant in developing the Philippine Defense Plan. Where is the Philippines anyway? Why was it so important? So before I go any further, the Philippines is right in the center of Southeast Asia. And we can see why it would be very strategic for both the United States and for Japan. In the case of Japan, as Japan needed natural resources in late 1941, the natural resources would be in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and the Southeast Asian resource-rich areas. So the Philippines stood right in the middle of that. The US bases were in the Philippines at that point in time, had to be neutralized. But even if the US bases were not there, the Philippines did lie right in the middle of all of these transport routes from Southeast Asia to Japan. So it had to be taken whether or not it was an American colony. This is a picture of one of the regular units of the Philippine Army training in 1941. It was very economical. We could only spend so much money per year. So whether it would actually meet the test of battle would really have to wait until the war began. What did happen was when the war broke out, President Roosevelt had created the US Army Forces in the Far East, or the USAFE. It was mobilizing, and according to the timetable, it would have been ready to face the Japanese by March of 1942. Unfortunately, the Japanese knew about that, and so they started to start the war in December of 1941. What is not known is that majority of these US Army Forces in the Far East were actually composed of Filipinos. As many as 80% of the members of the USAFE were Filipinos in the Philippine Army as reservists or in the Philippine Scouts. The original plan to defend the Philippines involved conventional resistance, beach defense. What we see here is a picture of Philippine Army troops training in that beach defense before the war. The thing is, the Japanese won control of the air and the sea right away on the first day of the war. And so the beach defenses collapsed very quickly, and the order had to be given to withdraw to Bataan and Corregidor for a fixed defense line while waiting for reinforcements. The line held for 3 months or 4 months, much longer than it was anticipated, but the reinforcements never came because Pearl Harbor had been hit very badly, and of course Wake and Guam were lost, so there was no route, there was no direct route to the Philippines by the time Bataan and Corregidor fell. Now, Filipino participation in the defense has not really been very well explained outside of the Philippines. There were Philippine pilots who were flying outmoded planes, such as this P-26 obsolete fighter plane flying against modern Japanese Zero fighters. And one of them is supposed to have shot down 1 or 2 bombers, not yet confirmed. But definitely because of that one-sided nature of the war, the Japanese held air and naval supremacy. There was no way of getting reinforcements to the Philippines. We come to April 9, 1942, when the largest surrender of American forces together with the Filipinos took place in Bataan. Less than a month later, you would have the last bastion of Corregidor standing, and that would fall. And that led to the Japanese occupation of the Philippines in most parts of the country. The Japanese occupation brought in much hardship to Filipinos. It led to starvation, it led to shortages of everything imaginable, fuel, transportation, clothing, because the Japanese priorities were really self-sufficiency for the Japanese military in the Philippines, and anyone who bucked that trend, anyone who tried to resist, would be punished in the way that we see here. Fort Santiago was the darkest place in the whole of the Philippines where the Japanese military police had their headquarters. And so Filipinos were tortured, they were killed, they were maimed in this particular place and other areas in the Philippines. This leads to the resistance movement that became very active throughout the islands. This was a spontaneous nationwide movement, even with the collapse of the regular or the conventional defenses in 1942. Even before the fall of Bataan, you already have guerrilla resistance movements starting out in areas that were taken by the Japanese but out of touch with the headquarters of the US Army forces in the Far East. So you have posters like this, you have a Japanese soldier looking at it actually, and then you have leaflets that were distributed showing how the Japanese promises were really not real and that they were not tangible. So we talk about a spontaneous national movement with people from the mountain provinces, indigenous peoples, working with their own native weapons, using bows and arrows and shotguns and so forth. And you have others who were regular members of the Philippine Army who had volunteered. You even had children, you had college students, and you had women as well. So the major problems of this resistance movement, well, it was a nationally felt resistance movement, was organization, how to organize under the Japanese administration. Who was to lead? Would you have senior officers or would you have juniors who had more ideas than the outmoded ideas of the seniors? There was turfing. There was also ideological problems. One group was communist in Central Luzon, and so there were ideological issues. Then there were Japanese punitive raids. They tried to crush the resistance wherever they could, employing spies. There was the Japanese military police, or the Kempeitai, which utilized torture. And of course, there were lack of weapons and ammunition. This led to a great deal of ingenuity, where things like curtain rods were made into bullets and homemade guns. There were characteristics of different regions. Some of them were terrain. Philippines is an archipelagic country, so it was difficult to unite the different islands. Some were very mountainous. Others were flat plains where the Japanese dominated. So unification was a major issue. But for some areas, particularly in the central Philippines and in Mindanao, unification became a reality. There were even women leaders, and there were children who were operating as couriers. Once some of these guerrilla units managed to make contact with General MacArthur's headquarters in Australia, you have submarines coming to the Philippines, bringing in much needed arms, ammunition, and even propaganda materials. The arms we see here being distributed were brought by submarines. And the propaganda materials, which always featured the profile of MacArthur and the famous "I shall return" pledge, this, of course, became reality to most Filipinos, and many Filipinos still remember this with a great sense of sentimentality. They were not all MacArthur. President Quezon, who was in exile in the US, also sent some messages, and so it was a combined Filipino-American effort. And eventually, some of the areas would have been consolidated, becoming very successful in unifying different groups of Filipinos against the Japanese. They would launch counter-propaganda, they would launch ambushes. The highest commander of the Japanese military would actually be ambushed in the island of Panay. He was not killed, he was not wounded, but the fact that the top brass of the Japanese army would be ambushed by a guerrilla outfit was something that was hard to believe. This triggered several Japanese reprisals, however, which made all of this quite costly. For those who could not resist formally with guns or weapons or could get involved in the ambushes, there also was informal resistance, which meant avoidance of the Japanese or even using humor. Filipinos have a great sense of humor, and we were able to make jokes out of this, and even Japanese words were converted to Filipino words with a totally different meaning. So the Japanese did not realize it until too late. Now, some of the groups were so organized that they even issued their own currency that rivaled the Japanese-occupied currency. In Mindanao, they even issued their own postage stamps. And they also issued newspapers. All of these were being published or printed in the mountains using presses that were hidden from the Japanese. And the newspaper that we see here actually was hand-colored using crayons that someone smuggled into the mountains as well. And the role of the guerrillas in the liberation was very, very important because the Filipino guerrillas provided a lot of intelligence, telling Americans which beaches were safe and which beaches were heavily defended. So it led to a number of changes of landings because certain beaches could have been and should have been avoided, and others were already secured by the guerrillas. So one guerrilla unit in northern Luzon was of the strength and experience of one whole division and was used as a support for US military operations in the liberation in the northern part of Luzon. Now, of course, the whole war led to a great cost, and you have the Philippine government estimated 1 million Filipinos out of a population of 17 million. That's 1 out of every 17 Filipinos who died during the war. Now, this includes those who died of starvation, those who died of sickness, but many of them were killed by the Japanese or died because of their belief in supporting the resistance movement. 3 of them have been commemorated in a 1,000 peso bill. These are the people that we see here. The names may not mean very much to you, but Josefa Llanes Escoda was the founder of the Girl Scouts of the Philippines. She was a civic worker before the war. She was a suffragette. And she died because she was helping American prisoners of war, providing food and materials to them. Jose Abad Santos, the man in the center top here, was an acting president of the Philippine Commonwealth, captured by the Japanese. He refused to serve with the Japanese, and he was executed for doing that. And the other fellow, General Vicente Lim, first Filipino graduate of West Point, division commander in Bataan. He tried to organize a guerrilla unit, was caught by the Japanese, and was executed. The 3 of them, therefore, represent 3 areas of Philippine society: the military, the government, and the civil sector. And it showed that all of these people paid with their lives for what they believed in. And that was the pre-war way of life, freedom, liberties, and everything that they held dear. So with this, thank you very much for listening. Good morning, and thank you for coming.
Excellent.
Okay, I'm waiting for the slide, I guess, but should I start already?
Yeah,
here
there
we
you
go.
go.
Okay. So, hello everybody, it's great to be here, and I'm excited Ricardo and I were just talking about how it's nice to be able to represent a theater of the war that many of you are perhaps a bit less familiar with here. The Indonesian case, I think, also demonstrates the diversity of the experiences and viewpoints of people in Southeast Asia. Even within that region, you really can't talk about one Southeast Asian response. And one theme that I think the Indonesian case certainly highlights is a theme that was also shared across all of the many of the Asian areas that had been colonized, and that had to do with you had already been under colonization by a European power in some places for a very long time. And I think of a quote that I think is very representative and provocative from an Indian nationalist leader named Krishna Menon, who was asked in London in 1940. The Indian nationalists, many of them had trouble taking sides in the war. And this is something that shocked, needless to say, shocked people in the Allied countries. And in England, he was asked by reporters, why can't you take a side? Isn't it obvious how terrible and awful and evil the fascists are? And he said, well, you might as well ask a fish whether it would rather be cooked in margarine or butter. And I think this says a lot in terms of background. So I think that's really an important starting point. The view, certainly, of the introductory remarks also mentioned, talked about collaboration. But what does collaboration mean when you do not identify with the country that's been occupying you? And so for Indonesians, this was a very complicated question. From the Dutch perspective, it was very simple. Are you loyal to Holland or not? But from the Indonesian perspective, Holland or Japan, this was a dilemma. Okay, so again, to try to reinforce and illustrate, we already had one map, but I wanted to point out again where Indonesia is. It's an enormous country with an enormous population, rich in resources, and this made it a target as well. And you can see how strategically coming down from the Philippines, you can see how important and strategic Indonesia is on top of those resources. So it was a very appealing, it was a very important part of, of course, a very important part of the Dutch Empire, essential for the Dutch, and a big contributor to Dutch prosperity. We think of the Golden Age in Holland. At least a good portion of that came from the wealth of the Indies. So it was occupied by Japan between 42 and 45, just as in the case of the Philippines, followed by a war of independence with the Dutch. And as I said, very important resources there, and most importantly, oil. The Japanese were absolutely determined to get that oil one way or another. And Java, the island in the center there, is by far the most populated, and this is where a lot of the Japanese were focused for manpower and resources. It's also where some of the greatest suffering happened. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a session tomorrow, so I'm not going to focus on that. So 1941 is, I don't see the clock actually, so let me just keep an eye on the time myself. There we go, thank you.
I run a tight ship.
Yeah. 1941, in the period leading up to Pearl Harbor, many of you are probably familiar to some extent with the developments that led up to that, so I'm not going to go into too much detail. But it's essential to keep in mind that the Japanese had been at war in China since 1937. So that when Pearl Harbor happened, Japan was more than 4 years into a very intensive conflict already. And the dynamics of that conflict influenced what came next, including that move into Southeast Asia. So Indonesia's resources were an essential motive behind Pearl Harbor and the southern advance. In fact, Indonesia is often at the center of a lot of these histories that we don't necessarily think about. Indonesia, as an American, actually, originally, I've been living in Holland for a long time, but as an American, I'm aware that Indonesia is relatively invisible. I've sometimes been asked, where in Bali is Indonesia? Okay, so I'm not accusing anybody here of having that perspective, but Bali gets a lot more attention than Indonesia. It's remarkable given how enormous, and also enormous its population is, and actually how important it is strategically as well. So between December 41 and March 1942, as many of you will be aware, the Japanese attacked the Western possessions in Southeast Asia, along with starting with Pearl Harbor and moving into Southeast Asia with surprising ease. It was remarkable, even to the Japanese themselves, how easily this campaign went. It kind of went to their heads also. They started to think that they were supermen even, and that they could easily win the war, given how easily things went for them in the beginning. Indonesia was distributed between three different forces, which meant a lot of fragmentation. And isolation of the different parts of Indonesia. So you had the 25th Army in the west, the 16th Army in the center in Java, and the Navy in the north and the east. When the Japanese came in, they proclaimed themselves to be liberating Asians from Western domination, Western exploitation, Western imperialism. It was very stirring propaganda, and it's often remembered and narrated as a kind of a trick that the Japanese imposed on other Asians, lies that were spread around. They were lies, and it was a trick. The Japanese were not liberators. The Japanese were primarily interested in oil. But to call it a lie or a trick, I think, is a bit misleading, because a lot of the Japanese themselves believed it. In many contradictory ways, of course. The Japanese were imperialists. They were convinced of their own superiority. They were absolutely, all of them, from all the way across the political spectrum, they were interested in making sure Japan remained the dominant player in Asia. But this narrative of liberation was very stirring, also for Japanese. And so in the early going, the Japanese even came in flying Indonesian flags alongside the Japanese ones, and this was very powerful for an Indonesian population, which, as I said, was already mentioned in the introduction, that the Dutch were not very popular in Indonesia, and this warm welcome that the Japanese received was largely, most importantly, a reflection of how unpopular the Dutch were. In fact, if we look around Southeast Asia and the different responses, you mentioned already in the introduction that the Dutch responded very strictly and oppressively to Indonesian movements for self-determination. And so the response, therefore, from Indonesians was, well, let's see what the Japanese have to offer, because the Dutch haven't done that much for us. On the right here, we see a very interesting propaganda cartoon, which was printed and published just in the first weeks after the Japanese had occupied Indonesia. This is in Java. And the cartoon shows the Japanese coming in and spraying these nasty mosquitoes. So the Japanese as insecticide. Now, what are mosquitoes? They suck your blood. This is very powerful imagery, and we can recognize here, in case you didn't identify them, this is Churchill and Roosevelt. This cartoon was drawn by a very, very famous and popular cartoonist in Japan at the time, and he was a member of a squad of cultural specialists who are actually the central focus of my book. I'm interested in them because many of them believed in this mission, however, in however contradictory ways. So Indonesians were fearful, but they were also hopeful, excited by the talk of liberation from the shackles of Western colonialism. This was pretty radical stuff. And as I said, there was certainly a lot of irony in the Japanese claiming to be liberating anyone when they were, certainly equally good or better at oppressing and exploiting people in their empire. And this was something the Indonesians were going to learn very bitterly. But the Japanese believed that they were different. And they claimed to be kind of the older brothers who were going to help out their poor Indonesian brethren who had been under Western oppression. And the success of the Japanese in defeating the West seemed to support their propaganda that they had a recipe for success. And a recipe for success that was particularly appealing and useful for non-Western people. Japan, as the one successful nation that had modernized and was able to beat the West at its own game, and yet somehow retain its original Asian culture. This was the narrative. I'm not saying that this was the truth. Japan was modern. Japan was not what it claimed to be in propaganda terms. But this image of a Japan that sort of blended the best of the West and the East, this was a very powerful kind of propaganda message for Indonesians, for other people in other parts of Asia, and for the Japanese themselves. So again, with the background that the Dutch had really not offered very much to Indonesian nationalists, many Indonesian nationalists decided to join up, or at least to cooperate to a greater or lesser extent with the Japanese. Viewed in retrospect by the Dutch certainly as a quisling, as somebody who betrayed the nation. But as I said, this was a more complex question for Indonesians. So, as I said, as time went on, it started to become more and more clear that the Japanese were themselves colonizers, that their message was a big contradiction, because as much noise as they made about being different, in many ways they proved to be the same or even worse. Worse partly because of cultural frictions and complete ignorance and misunderstanding of Indonesian culture and Indonesian society. The Dutch, in that sense, had the advantage of having been in the Netherlands Indies for a couple of centuries, and the colonialism there evolved gradually. The Japanese came in and immediately imposed all kinds of rules and regulations and behaviors, which caused massive frictions. They forced Indonesians to bow towards Tokyo, for example. And this is in a country whose population is a great majority is Muslim and is used to bowing in one direction, and that's not to Tokyo, but to Mecca. So that was a big problem. Japanese administrators realized, some of them, they had some advisors who said, this is a huge mistake, let's stop this. But the damage was already done in many ways. And as time went on, again, this is something I'll detail more tomorrow, Indonesian living standards plunged. Instead of getting better, instead of bringing co-prosperity, they brought suffering, deprivation, exploitation. And as I said, beatings on the street if you failed to bow at the right moment, or if you failed to remove your headgear. For some Muslims, wearing some kinds of headgear can be a sign of respect. This is a very basic cultural aspect of the Netherlands Indies, of Indonesia, which was missed by many Japanese, who were, after all, used to lording it over the natives anyway. So as time went on, Indonesians became more alienated. Nationalist elites were discontented, but most continued to cooperate. They didn't really see any alternatives. It's also important to recognize that they did not want a Dutch return. And so even though they came to dislike or even really resent or hate the Japanese, many of them still decided still better to be on their side than on the Dutch side. So they felt, they had worked themselves into a very difficult position. This was something that Sukarno certainly found himself in. In 1944, Sukarno made publicity photos here, a publicity campaign for the Romusha, forced laborers, who were not called forced laborers at the time. They were just called laborers. And so the Indonesian nationalists were not necessarily entirely aware of what the Japanese were getting them into, but they went along, they lent their voices and their reputations to this Japanese program, which became increasingly oppressive, exploitative, and deadly eventually. Indonesian youth, who in the beginning had been very inspired by the Japanese, particularly more elite educated youth who were nationalist-minded, started to move away not only from the Japanese, but from those who were collaborating with the Japanese. And this creates a new kind of dynamic in Indonesian society, which is extremely important for what comes afterwards. Okay, if we look at the balance sheet, by August 1945, some 4 million Indonesians have died of starvation, disease, and forced labor. The percentage of the population, I think, is roughly similar, actually, to what you just mentioned. So I think in the Philippines, also a lot of this kind of material deprivation, disease, shortages, and famine were very present. I'll talk again tomorrow more about details. I'm happy to have that opportunity to do that. Indonesia was left in economic shambles, socioeconomically, in upheaval as well. The Japanese ended up more hated than the Dutch, and this is something that you see very prominently after the war. We can talk more about the details, but the Dutch return was no less desired. So the Indonesians and the Dutch blamed the Japanese for mobilizing the Indonesians against them. The true story is a lot more complicated, but there's something to be said for that. The Japanese had an interest, after all, in getting the Indonesians on their side. On August 17th, 1945, 2 days after the war ends, August 15th, Indonesia declares independence. And Sukarno makes that declaration actually under a little bit of pressure from Indonesian nationalist youth, but he manages to keep in power and to keep his influence. Japanese trained paramilitary, or PETA battalions, are now gearing up to fight the returning Dutch, and nationalist youth, as I said, were prepared to take the initiative. And I will leave my words there for now, but I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
I believe they lived up to all the standards we like to see at a symposium here. Appreciate your presentations very much, and I look forward now do a little bit of a roundtable, but I tend to think that you all are going to have a lot of really good questions, and I'm not going to occupy a lot of time. Two things, or one thing immediately comes to mind. In my own research, I was really struck by the fact that the Japanese official history series, military history series, of the campaign down to Java had what I thought was a very startling statement, and it was a picture of an oil refinery on Sumatra, Palembang, and the Japanese history said this was absolutely the #1 target of the whole southern advance that Japan conducted from December 1941 to May of 1942, which is an aspect about the Netherlands, East Indies, or Indonesia that is almost totally unknown. What I'd like to do now is recall Dr. Jose. What about the treatment of the guerrillas after the war by both the Philippine and the U.S. government? What, can you talk a little bit about that?
Okay, that's a long-standing issue. There were actually several angles to that. First is that the U.S. government was supposed to recognize quite a number of them. In fact, some of them had been recognized already during the war. Right. And that would bring in things like back pay, government recognition, hospital benefits, and all of that. The thing is, about 1946, the US Congress passed what they call the Rescission Act, which took away most of these Filipinos. And that still leaves a rather bad taste in the mouth for some. Quite a number of guerrillas who actually fought or even died were removed from the recognized roster list. So it still is a point of tension between the US and Japan today. But many were recognized and did and continued to receive benefits. They received educational benefits and so forth. There was another angle to it in which the guerrillas after the war, some of them used it as political leverage to get themselves into positions of power. In fact, one of the Philippine presidents, Ramon Magsaysay, was a guerrilla leader. He was unknown before the war. He was a bus driver, and he was a mechanic. So he thought he could fix the Philippines just like a mechanic could. Not that easy, but he did have that philosophy for a while. Yeah. Another one became a senator, and some of the guerrilla leaders became secretaries of national defense and so forth. So they were able to use that as political leverage. There was another angle to the guerrilla resistance movement, however, and this was the negative side of it. So it's really, when you look at Philippine sources, it's usually they're glamorizing the resistance movement. But some groups did not behave particularly well. They were bandits disguised as guerrillas. And so some Filipinos had to choose between the guerrillas or the fake guerrillas or the Japanese. And so after the war, there were trials held for guerrilla criminal behavior. Eventually, that was all resolved by the late 40s. But that recognition problem is still there. Guerrillas in government, that became something very important after the war.
Okay. Ethan, we talked about this in our Zoom or whatever here, but I think, and I think you made the point that sort of tracing the path of Sukarno from pre-war through the war to independence is a very telling sort of way of narrating the story of the Indonesia in the war.
Yeah, yeah, because he was already a target of Dutch suppression, so if you follow how the Dutch responded to Sukarno and the Indonesian nationalist movement, it was very heavy-handed. Whereas some of the other colonial powers being confronted with growing anti-colonial nationalism, which I think is a really important theme, actually, of the Second World War that we don't always pay enough attention to. So the different colonial powers responded differently. In the Philippines, the U.S. responded with, relatively mild compared to some of the other countries. I live in the Netherlands, and I'm not interested in just only being negative about my adopted homeland. It's very important to recognize the different levels of interest and investment that each of the colonial powers had in a given colony. So, for example, the British behavior towards one colony would be very different from their behavior towards another, the French, and so on. And for the Dutch, the Netherlands Indies was seen as absolutely essential. And therefore not something they were ready to even ponder giving up. So the response was based also on the assumption that the Dutch saw themselves as very paternalistic and successful colonial rulers, and they felt that the Indonesian, that Sukarno and the others represented, a group of something like bandits or radicals. And so the response was what you would do to a bandit or a radical. They didn't execute him because that might provoke too much of a response. They put him into exile from 1934 already. And so he was still under Dutch control, in exile and away from his people when the Japanese arrived in 1942. So this sets up a beautiful kind of slam dunk for the Japanese. They release him. And what better way to symbolize the Japanese as liberators than to finally free Sukarno from this imprisonment? And so, again, it's a long story, and I don't want to. I could talk all day about it, but this is a really important, I think, juxtaposition to recognize the Japanese could claim that they were doing. Maybe the Indonesians looked at the Japanese and they were fearful of them and worried and skeptical and so on. They weren't stupid, but they were willing and more open to what the Japanese might offer. And so this is something that I think affected most of the Indonesian nationalist elite, actually. So we see, by and large, a cooperative posture, which gradually starts to dissipate. But leaving someone like Sukarno, who's in a very prominent position, in a very delicate position. And he had trouble. Of course, this record of supporting the Japanese to the bitter end did not exactly serve him well politically. And there were those in Indonesia, particularly on the left side of the political spectrum, who tried to use this to undermine his authority and legitimacy as part of a larger kind of social struggle, political struggle within Indonesia that happened after the war. But I think, as we said in our conversation earlier, the fact that Sukarno actually wasn't unusual in following this trajectory meant that he still remained acceptable as Indonesia's leader, and he was hugely charismatic. He was a powerful speaker. He was able to mobilize people and their emotions and their feelings of nationalism in a way that no one else could, and became, for that reason, remained in the end kind of an indispensable player in the Indonesian nationalist movement.
Thank you. Now, we're going to be back tomorrow with Ethan to talk about what actually goes on during the occupation and the tremendous hardship, suffering, and mass death that takes place in Indonesia. So I want to turn now, however, to Dr. Jose to talk about the Philippines, because I think it's extremely unknown the degree to which the Filipino people suffered and the very dire situation they were in by 1945.
Yes. Okay, so one reason why many of the Filipinos really turned against the Japanese was, first, of course, they deprived Filipinos of their liberties. The press was totally censored, and by the 1930s, the Philippines had one of the freest presses in Asia. And I think we were proud of that at that time. The radio was modern, the press was outspoken, politicians were speaking their mind, and that was something the Japanese tried to clamp down on. So everything, free discussion, that was, textbooks were censored. Anything that mentioned democracy, that had to be erased. Anything mentioning the American Revolution or even Washington, those were removed from Philippine textbooks because the Japanese felt that was totally irrelevant. And everything was controlled. Instead of having a laissez-faire economy, which we were used to, you have natural selection of prices and all of this, the Japanese put up a very centralized economic system, which is very similar to Indonesia and the rest of Southeast Asia. We were not used to that. We enjoyed trade with the United States before the war. We could choose our trading partners. And now all of a sudden, everything had to be geared up to the Japanese war economy. So sugar, which was the #1 export of the Philippines before the war, that was cut down. And instead, we had to plant things like cotton. We had to plant other things that the Japanese military needed. That dislocated the whole economy. And that's one reason why things became very difficult in the last year of war, because the basics were now no longer there. Plus the fact that the Japanese military in the Philippines was ordered to work on self-sufficiency basis. Rely on everything in the Philippines. Don't expect anything to come from Tokyo. Live off the land. That also dislocated everything. And that resulted in very severe disruption to the Philippine economy. Plus, of course, the beatings, as Ethan mentioned. If you did not bow properly, you were slapped and all of that. That also happened in the Philippines. If the case in Indonesia is you had to bow to Mecca, the Filipinos faced, it was very personal for Filipinos if they were slapped in the face. We never get slapped in the face. So when the Japanese
thing in
came
Indonesia.
when the Japanese came slapping, that was something we could not. And if you saw your grandfather slapped or your grandmother slapped, that's something you couldn't tolerate. So resistance.
Yeah, I should add, the Japanese military made extensive use of physical punishment for infractions, real or imagined. And one of the most common practices was slapping. So that was deeply ingrained in Japanese servicemen, that this is how you react to some sort of infraction. And when they turned around and inflicted this on these populations elsewhere, that just tremendously redounded to the detriment of the Japanese occupation. And the other thing Jose's talked about, which is true, everywhere the Japanese went, because Japan was not a wealthy nation, wherever they went, their armed forces were told they would live off the land of that nation or wherever they were. And of course, they not only lived off the land, but they made sure they lived well off the land. And this had resonated down the pike. One of the interesting aspects about the American occupation of Japan was that although Washington had given an option to General MacArthur that American occupation forces, we could have the Japanese feed them and support them, he made a decision right at the start: no, we will feed our own troops, we will support our own troops, we will not rely on the Japanese. And this, given what the Japanese plunged into immediately after the war, this literally was a matter of life or death for probably hundreds of thousands of Japanese, if not millions. Let me come back to one other issue that I wanted to talk to. You mentioned, you talked about the diversity of the populations in the Philippines, and I think, could you elaborate, because it's an incredible story. I mean, this is not one unified culture, unified people. It's incredibly divided.
Yes, the Philippines is composed of 7,000 islands. So it's said that if you put 3 Filipinos together, you have 4 associations, something like that. So the potential for disunity is very strong. In fact, one problem in Bataan was some of the soldiers could not understand their officers giving commands. The one thing that unified the Philippines prior to the war was most Filipinos could speak in English. The public educational system had taught Filipinos English, but not everyone had gone to the public schools. So there were people who could not understand that. And so unifying that diverse population was very difficult. In fact, you go to Mindanao, the southern Philippine island, the Muslims had never been conquered by the Spaniards, and they were very proud of that. The Americans had managed to win them over. But when the Japanese came in, the unique thing is that you have Filipino Muslims fighting the Japanese together with Filipino Christians, and they were at odds with each other before the war, with Americans. So it's a very interesting case where you have mountain peoples fighting together with the lowlanders, and before there was animosity between them. And it was one thing that you had these different groups having a common enemy. In a sense, one way of looking at the Japanese occupation is that there was such a swelling of anti-Japanese sentiment that it was nationwide. It cut across cultural groups, cut across languages and so forth. But with the return of peace, then you have that. It's difficult to maintain that if you don't have a common enemy. So there was some degree of unity that was sown during that time, but how to maintain that after that emergency, that was another problem.
If I can say something very briefly on the
sure,
Indonesian case. Very interesting, very similar background, cultural diversity. These two archipelagos are very close to each other, and I think, historically, before the arrival of the European colonizers, there was a lot of overlap and similarity between the two of them. Indonesia also very diverse, but the Dutch chose not to teach the mass of Indonesians Dutch. They actually saw this as dangerous if too many Indonesians could speak Dutch. So they preferred to keep different Indonesian ethnic groups speaking their own languages. Another slam dunk for the Japanese, they come in and say, let's all speak Indonesian. For the Japanese, of course, they wanted to teach Japanese as well. They tried to, they forced, or at least they pushed Indonesians to learn Japanese. That wasn't, that's another whole story. But they realized the strategic value of using Indonesian everywhere. This was a big win for the Indonesian nationalists, and it also made the Japanese look good, at least for a while. So it's another contrast in the two places.
Thank you. I'd love to go on, but I know you all have some questions. And Jeremy, I'm going to turn it over to you for your usual efficient behavior.
Thank you to our panelists, Rich, Dr. Jose, and Dr. Mark. First question is to your left, gentlemen.
I have a question for each of you. Dr. Jose, the question is, I know after the war, the Filipino people were very upset about war crimes and Hirohito not being prosecuted. I wonder if you could talk about how the next generation viewed Japan in light of that miscarriage. And then Dr. Mark, I want you to be able to tell us what a hero you were in doing your research. Please let us know about that.
Thank you.
Okay, for the first question on war crimes, of course, the Philippines had several war crimes. We participated in the Tokyo war crimes trials. That was the Class A level. We had a judge who was up there on the bench. And we had the prosecutor. I think we had one prosecutor who argued the Philippine case. So when the Tokyo trials actually finished in 1949, the Philippine side was very disappointed with the general trend of the Tokyo trials. And our Justice Hardalesa, issued a dissenting opinion saying everybody should have been considered guilty and everybody should have been hanged and so forth. So the spirit of vengeance was very strong. Now, after the war, that spirit tended to dissipate, particularly in the 1960s, when Japan became a closer economic partner of the Philippines. And Japan needed the Philippines as an economic partner for export of finished products and so forth. And the Philippines needed investment. So especially by the late 60s and the 70s, you have Japanese coming back to the Philippines. And we were one of the few places where actually the Japanese were allowed to put up memorials to their war dead. So the Americans, of course, put up their memorials. We have the American Cemetery in Manila. But the Japanese, as early as the 1970s, were allowed to put up their own memorials without English translations. So it was in that spirit that I think the administration felt Japan was geographically too close to the Philippines. We couldn't let this hatred last forever. And so Japan did become a major trading partner. It still is the major trading partner of the Philippines today. Most of the youth today are more familiar with anime and manga and so forth. World War II, that's something that's long past.
Yeah, if I can just, I'm going to answer the question that was directed at me, but I wanted to chime in also that Japanese nationalists nowadays, right-wing revisionists and so on, often misrecognize the current enthusiasm for Japan in Southeast Asia as evidence that things weren't that bad in World War II. This is a big mistake, obviously. But the same pattern, I think, in Indonesia too. About me being a hero, I think was that a planted question? Thank you. Well, we were talking about it earlier. Actually, I think it's not just a problem in Indonesia, but the Southeast Asia in general, there was so much devastation and destruction And then in the case of Indonesia, unlike in the Philippines, there was a huge power vacuum at the end of the war because no fighting took place in Indonesia, except if you look at New Guinea to the east. But for the rest of Indonesia, it was still under Japanese control at the time of the surrender. So there was a window there of a couple of months where the Japanese were actually the only force in control. They had surrendered, but they were still expected to be maintaining order, and that also gave them lots of time to destroy the evidence. So there were fires burning. There are stories of fires burning in Tokyo in late August in 1945, too, of all kinds of documents going up in smoke. That much more in Indonesia. The record keeping during the occupation was already kind of a mess, and then came the revolution. People were busy with other things. So a historian trying to go back and piece this together ends up with a scattering of documents that the Dutch collected mainly for prosecution purposes. They wanted to catch and try who they thought were responsible. There were some documents, but kind of in a messy form in the Netherlands. And on the Indonesian side, there was almost nothing, no kind of written records really left over. Indonesians were fighting for their lives in many cases, and so you end up with oral testimonies. And there was a considerable collection of very interesting Indonesian oral testimonies that was collected in the 70s and 80s, which includes the Japanese period, although it wasn't focused on it. But those reflections are very much colored by retrospect, by the awareness that the occupation had been an absolute disaster. And certain kinds of people were very much at that point, they were very much, often they tended to narrate their own experiences as a national experience. So if it wasn't about resistance to the Japanese or collaboration with the Japanese, if it was something in between those two things, people didn't narrate it themselves. Many Indonesians, as I said, responded positively to the Japanese, but then later on realized that was a mistake. So they're not going to narrate those experiences of the early part of the occupation, certainly the way that they would at the time. And so how do we get back to that experience at the time? Because this is what I was really interested in. And what I ended up using a lot in my research in my book are propaganda materials, which is, of course, a questionable kind of source, because these are produced for public consumption with the Japanese censor in the foreground or in the background. But what I found was that, at least in the early stages of the occupation, there was a relative amount of autonomy allowed to Indonesians to join and to use their voices to join in this shared struggle against the West. And as I said, that sense of a shared struggle was genuine, even if many Indonesians were not exactly in love with the Japanese. So I discovered that there was a lot of kind of shared interests and overlapping agendas, which Indonesians did feel comfortable talking about in the newspapers, for example. And there were Japanese also who were given a remarkable amount of autonomy early on in the war, in the occupation, by the Japanese leadership, because they were starting to recognize that the best propaganda is when you give people some autonomy and freedom to really talk about what they believe in. So these Japanese propagandists, they were very professional, they were very motivated, they were almost like missionaries of Greater Asia and liberation. And they found Indonesians who were also, again, as I said, for their own reasons, who were motivated to do the same. So that ended up being the primary base of material for my research. Yeah.
Two things real quick. In the Imperial Army, there was a saying, Java is heaven, Burma is hell, but nobody returns alive from New Guinea. And that was how they saw the war. And Dr. Jose wanted to take this opportunity. We have some very special guests here.
Yes, I think they are in the audience. Two of my friends are here. They said they'd be here. One of them is the grandniece of Jose Abad Santos. I showed you the picture of the 3 Filipinos who were martyred during the war. I think she's supposed to be here. I'm not sure if she is. The other, well, she is attending the conference anyway. And the other one is, she's the daughter of a Filipino-American who came to Mindanao on one of those guerrilla submarines and attacked the Japanese and taught the guerrillas how to fight. sabotage and everything. So she's supposed to be in the audience as well.
Desiree and Marie.
Yeah.
Desiree Benipayo. And Marie, thank you for being here with us.
Yeah, if I could just, you mentioned Java is hell, Java is paradise. That's another part of the challenge of researching this period. The Japanese had a good time in Java. And that's not a story that you're really eager to tell anybody afterwards. So this was another big problem. Yeah.
Next questions to your right, please.
It's for Dr. Jose. My research on your topic indicated there were nearly 250,000 guerrillas fighting across the island, which was a significant number. Could you tell me approximately how many Japanese soldiers that tied down and prevented from defending other areas?
Yes, thank you for the question. I think at the end of the war, there were about 500,000 Japanese who were in the Philippines. And many of them were in the mountains. Their main task was not to fight the Americans or the guerrillas, but to tie them down, prevent them from being landed on the shores of Japan. And I think they were rather successful in that regard. That 500,000 was when the war ended. I think there were much more than that during the course of the war. The Philippines actually served as a R&R station for Japanese coming from New Guinea, from the South Pacific, and those who were headed for the South Pacific also transited the Philippines, and the wounded and the sick wound up in hospitals in the Philippines. So as a supply area, it was very important, and tying down American troops, that was a very strategic decision made by Tokyo to keep them in the Philippines as long as possible.
There's a great book called Implacable Foes, and one of the main themes of that work, it really recreates clearly just how grinding those campaigns in the Philippines throughout the islands were on the units that were earmarked to invade Japan. And those units were not in great shape after these campaigns, due to casualties and some other factors or whatever. But that's a whole dimension of this whole endgame against Japan that's also very important.
Next question is going to be in the center with Connie.
I have a question about the Philippines. You said a couple of things. One, there was a love-hate relationship, and the U.S. was, that the Philippines was mostly independent. Can you talk a little bit about how, before the war and during the war, that the Filipinos, could they consider themselves mainly free, or I've always been a little confused on how much, free they felt.
Yes, thank you for the question. It's a very interesting question. Now, before the war, the Philippines was in that transition state, the Philippine Commonwealth as it was, but it was still a colony. So, in fact, all government officials had to swear allegiance to the United States. And thus, during the war, that was one of the criteria that would determine whether Filipinos who collaborated with Japan were traitors or not, as was used after the war. So, during the war, or even as the war was going on, there was a great deal of confidence that the U.S. was going to win, the U.S. was going to send reinforcements to the Philippines. So I think most of the Filipinos fought on the side of the United States, partly on that basis, but also on the basis because there were others who completely said, even if the Americans were not there, we would have fought anyway. It was part of this tradition of fighting for freedom before. That continues on after the war because many Filipinos would apply for recognition with the U.S. government because they needed the back pay. After the war, they were destitute, they needed money. But others did not apply for recognition. I have met quite a number who said, we fought for the Philippines and that's enough reward for ourselves. And so why should we apply for back pay when we were fighting for the Philippines? So there's this kind of dynamic, two sides or more sides. During the war, I think they were not fighting so much for back pay, but really fighting to avenge the abuses that they had seen right in front of them. Only later on when this thing comes in that, you might get something after all all the difficulties. Some of them would have gone into that level, but there were others who did not. And some would really stay steadfastly. We were fighting for the Philippines. We don't need any other assistance.
In the back to your left.
Hello, I have a question for Dr. Jose. So the Philippine resistance could be considered one of the most effective resistances in the war in general. What made them so effective in compared to the resistances in Europe and the rest of Asia?
Good question. And I think the one reason for this is because there was a tradition of guerrilla resistance. One Filipino author, in fact, wrote a whole book titled The Philippine Guerrilla Tradition, saying that some of these tactics had already been developed during the Spanish period. And there was this spirit of you're fighting for a land that you know, you're fighting for your own people. And I think that fact plus the popular support, I think also, well, to add to that dimension is many Filipinos had also watched documentaries on what was going on in Nazi-occupied Europe. So that was one sense of inspiration as well. There was one group of Filipinos who put up a clandestine radio station right in Manila, and who inspired them. They watched a movie about occupied Norway in 1941, which also talked about a clandestine radio network. So they said, if they can do it, we can do it. And these were teenagers, 19 years old, 18 years old. So when you have, there's a large group of guerrillas who are all college students. And when you have that kind of support coming in, and the elders saying, we will support you, we're a little too old for that perhaps, but we will support you, it is something that is a mass movement in a sense.
Let me interject here. Dr. Mark, could you talk a little about exactly what happened with all these slave laborers and just how god-awful that proved to be?
Well, I think the numbers are staggering. The typical picture is actually that most of them were shipped out of the country to go to places like the Siam-Burma Railroad. In fact, most of them, it turns out, were mobilized within the country, but it didn't make it any better. Right. They were subjected to very harsh conditions. There was starvation because the supplies themselves. This is something I'm going to illuminate more tomorrow. But all across Southeast Asia, you had economies that were dependent on international trade. That was what they were designed for as colonies. And when that's cut off, you have tremendous shortages. The Japanese desperation in the last year and a half or so of the war drove them to pursue all kinds of outlandish schemes. And a lot of that, the mobilization of local labor for that was also inspired partly by colonial attitudes, about the manual labor. You use these people for manual labor. So there was maltreatment, but I think even more than the maltreatment, there was the deprivation and shortages, this lack of medicine, lack of food, lack of clothing also, which led to kind of almost biblical kind of reality. By the last year of the occupation, there are, you hear from all kinds of narrators talking about people just dropping dead on the side of the road. That this was just a common scene across Indonesia, particularly in Java. I guess we'll have more time for more detail on that tomorrow.
But I wanted to get that in because that really is. And other thing, there's a great book by Greg Huff about Southeast Asia. And one of the little nuggets he dug out was, of course, the Burma-Siam Railway, the bridge on the River Kwai story that everyone's heard about, of course, had a horrendous death rate or whatever here. But Dr. Huff pointed out that there was actually a railway that was being built in Sumatra that, in terms of deaths per kilometer, was worse than the Burma-Siam Railway or whatever here. Just another illustration of how awful that is.
We're going to go to your right in the center.
I want to thank you again for a marvelous presentation. I wonder if you would address the role of women, the comfort women, maybe bring us up to date on what's happened.
Okay, it's the comfort women issue is, in the Philippine case, it surfaced only in the 1990s or so, but I had known of that. There were Japanese researchers who had studied that already as early as the 1970s, 1980s. But in the Philippine case, it surfaced in the 1990s. It was not as widespread as, let's say, in Korea or Taiwan or China, but it did happen on a significant scale in the Philippines. Now, the Philippine government was kind of two sides regarding this issue. And it still is, because Japan is still a major trading partner of the Philippines. So this has been something that women's groups have been rallying around for a long time. They still are. And one thing that happened fairly recently, just before the pandemic struck, was a statue was put up in Manila to commemorate the Filipino comfort women, the sexual slaves. The government eventually took it down very surreptitiously on the guise that there was a public works project going on there. But it seems like some Japanese elements were behind that, and they did not want it there. And later on, when the group that had put up the statue decided to put it up in private land, so it could not, the government could not interfere. And they were actually ready to move that to a churchyard, and the statue mysteriously disappeared. So it still is a contentious issue. The women's groups are still fighting very hard, they're concerned groups. The government is of two minds about it. It's not taking a particularly strong stand on the issue.
I think a similar pattern in Indonesia. I think the Japanese right-wingers who have, the nationalists who have been kind of on the ascent in the last decade in particular, I must say under Prime Minister Abe, we've heard more of these kinds of voices. They have tried to kind of turn back the research to try to combat a lot of the research that has been done in the last couple of decades, which has highlighted the system. One of the questions they often raise is, why did this become such a big issue in the 90s if it really was such a big issue? Well, I have a very, if I may say, a provocative answer in response. Patriarchy is the reason that we did not hear much about it until the 90s. The world changed. That doesn't mean that the comfort women's suffering or the crime of the comfort women was any less when it happened, but it means that we are paying much more attention to these kinds of crimes and thinking about them as crimes than we used to. And that's not a kind of a sneak attack from Korea or China, which is how the Japanese right wing likes to characterize it. Another reason that a way that they do that is to say, well, look, the Southeast Asian countries, we hardly hear anything from them about this. So the reason for that is primarily economic and geopolitical. Southeast Asia is very, very closely dependent, reliant on Japan, economically interdependent, and it's just not a priority for Southeast Asia's leaders who have other very pressing, and admittedly other pressing issues to deal with. So it's important to recognize that there's all kinds of variables and factors that contribute to these different impressions, but to keep our eyes on the ball as well, I would say.
Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Frank, Ricardo Jose, and Ethan Mark. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great job.